Welcome to the AIOps Evolution Weekly broadcast. This series features discourse on topics pertinent to the C-level conversation revolving the integration of artificial intelligence into the ever-evolving IT operations landscape. Discover trends and actionable tips for digital transformation, as well as the latest news on how AIOps is transforming business and government operations to create flow in their organization. And don't stay in the dark on the latest industry news. Join the AIOps Evolution community to stay connected and subscribe to the show at AIOPSevolution.com. Now, let's join our hosts, Sean McDermott and Bill Driscoll, IT thought leaders, visionaries, and the voices on the other end of the mic for the latest episode of AIOps Evolution Weekly.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's AIOps Evolution Weekly broadcast. I'm your host, Sean McDermott, and my co-host, Bill. How are you doing today, Bill?
Doing good. How are you doing, Sean?
I'm doing well. How was your week?
It's been good. It's been there's a lot going on, which is always good. So
we're it's better than not having anything going on, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Especially when you're working. But I hear you're on travel this week. Are you down?
Yeah, I'm actually in our Virginia office. So I came down for a couple days. I'm actually going to be here next week as well. We've got a lot of people in the office tomorrow. So,
well, good.
Or next week, I should say. Yeah,
good. So we're getting people back in the office. That's awesome.
Yeah, no, it is good. There's a few people I haven't seen in a year and a half, so it'll be nice to be in the same place as them instead of looking at them on a screen, right?
Yeah, I missed that too. So you want to talk a little AIOps for the week? Kind of cap it out?
That sounds great.
Cool. All right, so let's talk a little bit. So this week, like we talked about before, we were starting to kind of dig into different areas of operations and how AI applies into that world, because we've been talking mostly use cases around event monitoring, event management, correlation, stuff like that. So this week, I thought it'd be good to talk about asset management, right? So what do you think? And I know we've got a couple articles, our normal format. We've got a couple articles we want to talk about, but how about we dig into asset management and see how that goes?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, to define what asset management is and config management and CIs and CMDBs and all that. So I think it'll be a good conversation.
Awesome. Okay, so I am going to start with an article. So this is an article out of Tech Target by a guy named Stephen Bigelow, and what he talks about, he says, will DevOps spell the death of the CMDB? And I think this article is very interesting to me, because I think that when CMDB has been a big thing for me in my career and what we've been doing. And I think it's a very, single source of data is a really important thing, right? It's kind of the core foundation of pretty much everything. You can't do correlation and all that kinds of stuff without really a single source of data. But certainly, one of the things he talks about is some of the limitations of the CMDB, and it's time-consuming, manual effort, accuracy, and timeliness of the data, and I know that. I've worked just recently, I was working with a customer and we were integrating into the CMDB to pull some information out of it. And the data was just very spotty. In some cases, they didn't even have vendor names in there. And we wanted to set up some filters where we could filter out certain vendors, and we couldn't do it. So essentially for our use case, the CMDB is effectively useless because the data just isn't populated. And they had, I don't know, probably those ServiceNow standard CMDB configurations, so they probably had 100 plus fields, and maybe 15 of them were filled out, and the ones we needed weren't. So that to me is an indication, right, of the CMDB has always been a really hard thing to maintain and manage for companies. And so this article talks about that, and they talk about some of the challenges of CMDB. So they talk about data entry. How do you get the data in there? How do you do lifecycle management of maintaining the accuracy of the data going forward?
Mm-hmm.
How is the data utilized? And ultimately, how do you store? Because CMDBs can actually get pretty large. And they also talked about this idea of the CMDB and how it may or may not, mostly may not, be evolving in this new virtual world, right? So back in the day, when I actually worked at BMC for a little while, and CMDB was a big thing. I mean, they were one of the leading providers of CMDB back in the day,
Mm-hmm.
and we just had a tremendous amount of time. It took a tremendous amount of time of getting CMDBs, and most of CMDBs just weren't really implemented well. And I'm not really sure that's changed. And that was back when it was easier, where everything was physical, right? And you had physical servers and physical data centers. And now with virtual, with VMs and containers and microservices and things like that, you've got more virtual data. So you've got way more potential configuration items or CIs to manage. And that data is much more dynamic. It may be
Mm-hmm.
accurate now, and 10 minutes from now, it may not be accurate. So,
Right.
So that's kind of a little bit of the challenges of this. So this article is really talking about CMDB in the context of DevOps. I think there's more to talk about, but I'll stop there. You have any comments for you there?
Yeah, I think the death of this. Or what do they say? My death reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. I think that applies to the CMDB as well. That I think over 20 years ago is the first time I kind of got exposed to it. I think it was HP CMDB, maybe it was Remedy. What became Atrium at the time, but the exercise of we've got to keep it up to date, we've got to populate it, the time frame of collecting all that information, collecting all that data, and the cycles of the periodic updates of those, just it was always out of date, and then it became untrusted, and then it was never used, and it was just this just horrible cycle, right, that always existed. And I'd probably argue that today we do see CMDBs in use a lot more, because really the technology around the CMDB has changed. And I think, a couple of things is it's because so many things are more virtual, and there's access to discover those, the infrastructure items, the virtual items, the application information. There's so much more ways to sort of keep it up to date and keep it dynamically up to date. And it's easier than it was, I think, before, where there was just maybe less things connected, less sort of integrations there. But I think that the challenge today is just there's just so much information, and where do you cut off the information? And I think we sort of saw the advent years ago of the federated CMDB. And so I think that some of the major CMDB players, ServiceNow is one of them, they're able to tap into other data sources where, the detailed information is owned and residing in another system, but it's sort of federated into and accessible from the CMDB within ServiceNow, and then really the other processes around it. And so I guess, and sort of maybe a summary is I think the CMDB has always been there to serve the processes that it supports. So change management, incident management, problem management, service requests. And so I think, the CMDB is absolutely necessary for those systems, or at least the information that's in the CMDB. I think DevOps is just changing maybe where the line goes as far as what's maintained sort of maybe inside the database itself, the system itself, and what information really becomes sort of an extension of it through federation.
Yeah, I think that it really comes down to the use case, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what are you trying to do? And I remember having conversations, because when we started RealOps, 15 years ago, and we built this integration layer and all the adapters into all these different systems, I was having conversations with a lot of, pretty, smart people around CMDB, around this idea of federated CMDB. And at the time, federated was really more like, I'm going to pull out little pieces, metadata, and put it into the primary CMDB. But I was actually starting to think about this idea of a virtualized CMDB, right? Where you really have this kind of metadata layer, and when you need a piece of information, it knows where to go to get it, and it routes it down and actually does that pull and pulls the information up and provides it to you. And that way, because you have a lot of systems out there that are doing discovery and doing native things to keep their infrastructure, their particular point product up to accuracy, because they're doing things like virtualization and stuff like that. But the why replicate that? And I think that's where a lot of CMDB problems happen, is that where people are like, well, I need to get that information into the CMDB.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of discussions. I mean, this is going back a decade ago about, and this is before really virtualization, because we were just starting to automate virtualization and provisioning of VMs. And, one of my points is like, well, why do we need to bring any information into the CMDB? Why can't the CMDB just literally be like the Dewey Decimal System of telling you where the book is, where is the information you need to go, and leave the source of truth at the end systems that are collecting the data and have the most accurate information because of the way those applications are coded. So if you want to understand the configuration of server, go talk to the server configuration management system. Go talk to, at the time, Opsware or Blade Logic or something like that, because they'll have actually the configuration. Now it might be, let's go talk to Ansible, let's go talk to Chef, let's go talk to these applications and understand what the server configuration is at that time, and let's go talk to VMware. So I think rethinking the CMDB structure is very relevant. What's interesting, I think, is the applicability of AI into this, right? And machine learning to speed up the understanding of where that information is and where to grab it. And my point has always been around the CMDB is the CMDB only needs to be accurate at the point in time in which you're asking it a question, right? We don't need to index, millions of CIs when I only need to know information about 100 CIs, right? Now, the question is for speed purposes, do we need to do that? And do we need to bring all this data in and continually index it to index, tens of thousands of CIs just so I can ask a question that has a very limited scope? So I think that, machine learning can play a really interesting role in the processing of requests into the CMDB. And I say the CMDB loosely now, right? Not as necessarily a database, right? Traditionally, but really as a broker, and saying, okay, the request is coming in. We have an alert. We want to know what are all the pieces of that. What are all the components of that? So I'm going to reach out to Ansible, and I'm going to query Ansible for this information, bring it back in, and present it as part of the correlation engine. So I think machine learning can play a huge role in that, in the speeding of that interaction between the systems and the brokering of information. So,
no, I agree. I think that, I guess I totally agree with everything you just said there. But I think that you have processes, right, that you're conducting your business. You have that process relies on intelligence and decision making, and the intelligence and decision making relies on information, right? And I think that mapping and understanding in your enterprise, what processes are you trying to support, what intelligence and decisions need to be made, and where's the best source, where's the best location of that information. And I think as those processes and intelligence become much more machine learning intelligence, AI, robotic process automation, that just drives the speed at which that information kind of has to become available. So that's a very simple way of saying it, but it's complicated under the covers, and a lot of decisions that need to be made as to where that data resides.
Yeah, it's extremely complicated. And it's interesting. I thought this was a good article. I enjoyed reading it. The one kind of thing I take at the end is he says, final alternatives to deprecate and retire CMDBs in favor of other highly automated tools. And he has a link to there. So I clicked on the link, and it basically took me to an article talking about Ticketmaster and I think Ansible. Okay. And I thought that was a pretty bold statement with a very limited backup on the rationale of making that that statement. But I think in general the article was good in highlighting challenges that we've been seeing with the CMDB over the years, and then my thoughts on how do we augment this to really be machine learning driven, right? So
Yep, exactly. Great.
so cool. All
Well,
right, so moving on. You want to talk about you want to talk
Yeah.
about IoT. So let's talk a
Well,
little bit
I think
about
the
IoT.
bigger, I think sort of shifting, you brought up asset management in the beginning. We talked about CMDB, we talked about configuration items and discovery and kind of keeping all that up to date. That is all, what in mature and healthy organizations sort of view as a kind of underpinning of asset management, of taking those CIs and looking at those CIs from an asset management standpoint of the financials, the location, the transfer, the ownership, even in the cost of it, the depreciation of it. And so managing those financial assets, and those assets can be hardware, they can be software, they could be, virtual up in the virtual instances up in the cloud. And so that whole process is very much a very related process. And you also run into what information should we have, and should we centralize that? Should we integrate that with our CMDB? Should it be sort of connected together so we can look at it holistically, right? The usage of an asset would be something that's probably in the CMDB, but the actual existence of it and its financial information and who owns it is in the asset management system. And I think that this article we read, it's called IoT and IT Asset Management: How to Avoid the Impending Wipeout. It was written by Charles Miles from Pink Elephant. He really talks about we've got to get, as an industry and a lot of enterprises, asset management under control, because if you don't do it now, you've got a wave of IoT devices, blockchain, 5G technologies, more and more up in the cloud, and that support IoT devices. And how are you going to manage those? The article I think we're going to talk last is a bigger picture kind of view of IT asset management, and it covers the problem with kind of orphaned legacy assets that are out there that you're still paying for, that you're not using, or just untapped resources where you're going and buying more compute where you're already paying for it somewhere else and you don't need it. And so, getting those processes, getting those systems, getting config management and and asset management integrated in a way where you kind of have production reality and the financial reality all integrated. It's going to be critical for companies to do that and invest in that, because this IoT wave is coming, and there's going to be just more and more assets that you have lying around in the cloud or lying around in the physical world that you got to get under control. So I don't know if you had a chance to look at this article. Any thoughts you had, Sean?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this one. I have a lot of thoughts on everything.
I thought so.
So the reason being, because I'll make a shameless plug. There's another podcast I do called Cybersecurity After Dark, and we talk a lot about cybersecurity implications of this. So that's kind of my other passion in between AIOps. I do a lot of work around cybersecurity, and so this idea around IoT, it is, to me, this article I think is good in the sense that it's talking about the wave of IoT devices coming, right? And as we look at the implications of that on the infrastructure and the environment, it's massive. And to me, and one of the couple points he puts in here is that you really need to be looking at this as an enterprise strategy, and how are you going to look at this enterprise-wide, because IoT may reside in lots of different places in the infrastructure. It may be physical, right? So beacons inside physical offices may be run by the facilities organization. It may be run by particular organizations that are using IoT for some kind of sensor or something like that. And it may not necessarily be deployed by the IT department. And this kind of plays into the whole shadow IT thing. And what I found kind of interesting about this article is that, it talks about having this enterprise strategy for getting all these IoT devices under IT, which sounds great on paper. But this to me is a leadership problem, right? This is a corporate leadership problem of saying we've got to get all these assets under one policy, because we know how it works, right? Nobody really wants to go to IT, right? Because IT is going to basically say, okay, well, we need to do analysis, we need to do understanding, we need to do an architectural review, we need to do a security review, and nobody really wants to do that. They just want to deploy their solution, right? And we see that with business applications all over the place. We see that with organizations, application organizations that are bringing up instances in the cloud. So IoT is really, in my mind, no different. And I think he kind of makes that point. And he also made a point very early on, which I just found kind of funny, but like scary, is today most IT organizations can't even manage laptops and software licenses effectively. And we're going to talk about software licenses in a second. But my big takeaway from this article, and I think this is a good article for people to read, so thanks for bringing it up. But I think my big takeaway out of this is that this is really a corporate leadership problem, right? Because you have to be able to create an enterprise policy on how to get all these assets under control. And I'm not talking about just IoT, but I'm talking about shadow IT and shadow applications and SaaS applications that IT doesn't know anything about. Instances and bringing up VMs in the cloud outside of the corporate VM public cloud environment. And until companies take this as a leadership challenge to understand that these things have implications, and because of the stuff that I'm doing, the work that I'm doing over in cybersecurity, I think probably the biggest discussion point around this should be risk management. And what does it mean as a company to understand your risk and being able to talk about why IoT needs to come under IT and needs to be managed from a corporate enterprise policy, because it's all about risk management. And on my other podcast, we literally talked about IoT devices a couple of weeks ago and how they are just so insecure and so poorly managed, and firmware is having, massive security vulnerabilities where people can take over webcams and baby monitors and listening devices and Amazon Sidewalk devices coming into the corporate network and connecting to the corporate network. This has to be a leadership problem from a risk management discussion. And I think once you do that and you educate leadership on why all this stuff is important, you can now start creating enterprise policy. When you create enterprise policy, then you can start thinking about how to get all these things under control, which then ties back to our last discussion is like, well, how do you maintain all this stuff? And you probably need a CMDB to do it, right? There's some federated CMDB. So this article, I like this article a lot.
Yeah, I think it just you said risk management, risk control is probably a great way to say it, because I think when you're just looking at functionally, how do we functionally accomplish something in the business can run out and do that. But I think you've got to look at it holistically and say we're moving the walls of our business, right, by putting these IoT out there, and we need to make sure we've got controls, financial controls, access controls, and security controls. So I think you're absolutely right, and I think that risk management can still be executed in a distributed way, but it's got to be centralized, centrally controlled.
Yeah, I mean, it's you could put everything into this, right? Because everything's going out to the edge, right? I mean, mobile devices, right?
Yep.
Mobile devices that have access to corporate websites that don't require VPN or any kind of like encrypted technology. That's a problem too. So, and again, to me, that's a leadership problem. It's a leadership problem of helping leaders understand what the risk and how to quantify the risk. So if you want to learn more about that, shameless plug, go over to Cybersecurity After Dark and you can hear us talking about that. So any more points on that?
No, I think that covers it. I think it's a good lead into just the bigger topic of the last article that we saw from, I think, Micro Focus. A gentleman from Micro Focus wrote it.
Yeah. So this is, I read this article, and this has a very close place to my heart. I think I said that about the other one, did I?
The whole topic.
This is this was written by Siram Balapragada. So He's with Micro Focus, which is, I assume he's formerly IBM, right, with the acquisition, or
it's HP.
I'm sorry,
HP.
HP. You're right.
Was
Absolutely.
got moved over to Micro Focus.
And so I assume he's talking about the HP product line of, OpenView and those operational products. And what he's really talking about here is software asset management, right? And one of the things that, like I said, it's near and dear to my heart because, again, shameless plug, I launched a company a couple years ago called Red Monocle, which is focused on tools rationalization and application portfolio rationalization. So, and that's effectively what he's talking about. And I think that it's a broad conversation because you can look at it. There's so many use cases to this. There's use cases around contract obligations. And so if you look at companies like Flexera that are doing contract rationalization, then you have the ability to start, building the business case. And we've worked with Flexera. I mean, in full disclosure, we were partnered with Flexera a few years back and did some implementations, and it's around contract management, understanding, what do we actually have? What are we paying for? How do we protect ourselves against vendors coming in and essentially suing us for, license violations? Super, super complicated, right? Because there's so many licensing models. And even companies like Microsoft have hundreds of licensing models, even for the same software. And then you got SaaS applications and things like that. But then there's other use cases around general rationalization of products and saying, do we need all these products? And do we have overlaps and gaps? And this is what Red Monocle does, is that do we have overlaps and gaps? And where are our gaps at? And what are our requirements? And are our products meeting those requirements? And if not, what technology should we be acquiring? And where do we have overlaps in technology and investing in the same areas, whether through acquisition or different business units buying similar products, that we can standardize and free up money for investment in new innovative technologies for filling those gaps. So good article. I mean, like I said, I can't complain about it because this is like, I've been talking about this for years.
Near and dear. Yeah, I think the whole area really gets into the subtopic of asset management, which is really, there's intelligent asset management, but intelligent, what he calls intelligent software asset management, the subset of software. And I think that's, as I read through it and kind of thought more about it, I mean, some statistics, he said 72% of organizations lack solid software asset management strategy, 74% haven't created a formal SAM function, and 83% didn't see it as strategic. And as I think about this problem, I think of it like a U.S. Congress type problem, right? Where you can choose to keep going and buying more software, or keep raising the debt limit, right? And keep spending more money in the government, or you can look for one, fraud, waste, and abuse, and I think that happens in software asset management. It's just waste. I wouldn't say fraud, but it's waste and abuse of not using licensing, not using the assets, letting them continue to pay for them while you're not leveraging them, not doing intelligent models of how usage-based pricing or usage-based asset. And then I think just from a, untapped, what is it, billions of dollars are not even, or trillions probably aren't paid in taxes every year. So there's just a collection problem too. And so I think just really getting the financial aspects and finding, how do we spend less money on IT? How do we better use the dollars we're investing in IT? Software asset management is really a critical must as far as that goes, because just so much gets lost without being able to centrally do it, or you're spending so much time and money trying to track it in spreadsheets and without a function that's sort of integrated with the rest of your asset management strategy. So, I think that it is surprising that such a large numbers of enterprises, at least the survey, this IDG research survey, didn't even see software asset management as really as critical to their business. Maybe they believe they're already doing it pretty well, and maybe a lot of them do have products like Flexera and other more niche products that are doing it, versus maybe the way HP or Micro Focus is sort of looking at it. Maybe they're not thinking it more broadly enough, right? So yeah, I think it is a big challenge, a big area of focus, but there's multiple ways to address it. There's a lot of products out there that are moving into the space, or already doing the work, like Flexera.
Yeah, I think that Flexera has an interesting business model or message, right? And that is, let's get your licenses under control so you one can have a better idea what's going on, and which is a good thing, but also you can make sure that you're within compliance of your licensing agreements, so that if you're using more instances of some kind of Oracle database, you're licensed for 1,000 and you're using 4,000, 5,000, then you don't get sued, right? And they're actually, they do. I mean, we have actually been audited by Microsoft several times, and all it takes is one person to basically send a message to Microsoft and say, "Hey, we think that I think that my employer is not adhering to the licensing agreement," and you'll get a notification, right? And usually through a third party, because a lot of these software vendors use third parties. And we've had that happen, and we have to go through and we have to prepare an audit. Luckily, that we've got pretty much everything under control, and we can pull the audit documentation pretty quickly. We send it over to them, and within a week or two, we get a response saying, "Hey, everything looks good, no problem, move on." But that's a lot harder in billion-dollar enterprises that have $50-100 million contracts and don't really have a good idea of what actually is being deployed, whether it's Adobe Acrobat or Adobe Suite. Or it's Oracle databases, right? Where you got app dev teams just bringing up Oracle databases all day long and not really thinking about it. So that's a really good use case, and I think that's where Flexera has been very successful. And one of the things that, this isn't a plug for them, but they've figured out, and they do a lot of work on the back end with the vendors on their licensing models and things like that. So much so that if you actually have Flexera, a lot of vendors will actually say, well, we trust the Flexera database, the Flexera information, so whatever Flexera kicks out, we'll take as your audit report. But I think the other opportunity, right, is rationalizing your investment. So it's kind of like basically saying, hey, I have a portfolio, and I want to have a balanced portfolio with emerging stocks and growth stocks and international stocks and fixed income and municipal funds and tax-free. And I want to have a nice balanced portfolio, like every financial advisor tells you. And you go into it and you've bought all these different municipal funds. And when you dig into every one of these municipal funds, you find out that you've got like 25% of your portfolios in Apple, right? Because they all own Apple. Yeah. So that is a problem, because if Apple starts tanking, then your portfolio will go down, even though you think you have a balanced portfolio. So, and I think this is where machine learning really can come into this too, and because it's a lot of it is around, and this is what we've done at Red Monocle, right? Is that we've built algorithms that are process a lot of different data around capabilities of these products and requirements, and continually munge through that data, looking for anomalies, looking for overlaps and gaps in your infrastructure to help identify. Just like you're seeing in the banking industry with there's new investment applications coming out that are completely unmanned. They're all driven by machine learning, right? And you can sign up for it as put $10,000 into it, and they'll ask you a bunch of questions, and they'll actually invest and track the stock market and buy and sell based on your preferences. And it's all done through machine learning. So that's where I see IT or machine learning really kind of coming into the play here, because again, we're talking about software asset management, but we're also talking about this asset management in general, like the rest of this conversation we've had of IoT and servers and virtualized devices. All that stuff together makes up a pretty massive problem that humans generally just are not good at doing.
Yeah, and I think we just pull, there's financial people that are pulling data out of here into spreadsheets and slicing and dicing and looking for anomalies or looking for patterns or looking for how things roll up. And I think that's where putting a lot of this data into systems where you do have intelligence, you do have analytics, you do have machine learning that can look for things that don't look right, or look for things that sort of correlate with each other. the more you're going to have to, you're not going to have, the download the data into a spreadsheet and crunch the numbers, right? So
yeah.
Yep.
Good. Well, I think that's it for today. I wanted to thank our sponsor, Windward Consulting Group. Windward is the leader in AIOps, global leader in AIOps, and you can find Windward at www.windward.com, WINDWARD. And with that, Bill, I hope you have a great weekend, and
yep, you too.
And I hope and thanks everybody for tuning in this week, and we will see you next week. Take care.
Sounds good. All right, see you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation about AIOps and the future of IT operations. Interested in a deeper dive on these topics? Check out our resources available at AIOpsevolution.com. And remember to subscribe to get the latest episode.